Okay, so perhaps we should start by introducing ourselves, Anne. So if I go first, so my name is Becca Lacey, and I'm one of the co-directors of this MSc in Social Epidemiology. I am a life course epidemiologist. My research is all about kind of how childhood social circumstances potentially affect our health sort of longer term. So Anne, do you want to go next?
Yes, so my name is Peasey. I'm also in the Institute of Epidemiology and Healthcare in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health. I'm an epidemiologist, and I have a focus on social determinants of health. And I've been involved in quite a bit of research in Eastern Europe, as well as several cross-country cohort studies. And I think you'll see quite a lot of us, both Becca and I, if you join this master's program, because we teach across many of the terms of the teaching, as well as helping with the dissertations. Becca, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So we've put together just a few slides as a sort of introduction to this session to give you kind of a bit of an overview of what this master's program involves. So it's the Masters in Social Epidemiology at UCL, which, as we've just said, is run by myself and by Anne. So why come to UCL? It's a great place. So it's very good for research. It's a really prestigious institution. So we were ranked second in the UK in the most recent research excellence assessment for research power, which is an excellent indicator of sort of how good and how far-reaching our research is. In terms of the kind of university rankings, we do tend to rank quite highly internationally as an institution. So what does this mean for you, kind of considering coming to study at UCL? So as I've mentioned, UCL is a very research intensive university. So and a lot of our teaching is led by our research. You'll be taught by internationally renowned staff. So UCL really attracts staff who are real experts in their field of study. And an opportunity to grapple with real world problems, which will be important for kind of careers and things like that going forwards. So our Masters in Social Epidemiology is based in the research department here of Epidemiology and Public Health, EPH. So we're one of 4 research departments that sits within UCL's Institute of Epidemiology and Healthcare, so IEHC, which is led currently by Professor Andrew Hayward. But you'll be taught by mainly from staff from this department, but actually for staff from across the whole institute and potentially beyond as well. In terms of what you'll learn whilst you're with us, so obviously about the topic of social epidemiology. So social epidemiology is all about health inequalities at the population level. It's about links between the social environment and health. So one example of this might be how your work affects your health. And then throughout the year, we talk about some of the potential explanations of why the social environment affects health. So we look through some things like material explanations, behavioural, so things like differences in risky health behaviours, psychosocial explanations, which might be things to do with social relationships, and life course approaches. And life course is all about how, it's quite complicated, but it's all about how things influence each other over time. And alongside the social epidemiology content of the course, you'll also develop some really important skills and research skills. So these are things like the critical appraisal of evidence, so weighing up the quality of studies. You'll also obviously learn about epidemiological methods and quantitative research methods. And alongside all of this, we have a very applied statistical methods program as well that runs alongside. So you'll learn from a very basic level right through to quite an advanced level of statistics that are useful for being a social epidemiologist and conducting social epidemiological research. So what can you expect from us? So we talked about how UCL is a very good research institution. It's also a very good teaching institution as well. As I mentioned before at the beginning, our curriculum is really embedded in the research that we do, and the research that we do is right through all of the content, the teaching content that we have. You can expect to be respected by your peers and by staff. And being at UCL is a real opportunity to immerse yourself in the topic area and in your learning more generally. We're a really supportive and friendly program team. So you have myself and Anne, and we're supported by an administrator as well. But also you'll be provided with a personal tutor who will be somebody from our institute as well to provide pastoral care. And then in terms of what we expect from you, so we expect you to be really committed to your studies while you're at UCL. And we expect you to be kind of partners and in your learning and to take ownership of your learning. So this is a postgraduate course of study. So we give you kind of the starting point for lots of topics, but we'd be expecting you to spend time reading around things, for example. And finally, there's lots going on at such a big institution in central London. So we'd really encourage you to take an active role in the UCL community as well. And I'll hand to Anne at this point.
Thanks, Becca. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the programme. And in this photo, you can see a cohort from a couple of years ago when we were having one of our I think this was a Meet the Researcher meeting, which maybe Becca can tell you a little bit about later. So you can study this programme in 3 different ways. You can study full-time, and it will take you 1 calendar year, so a full year. Or you can study part-time over 2 years, or modular flexible over something between 2 and 5 years. And we can tell you a little bit more about the details about if you choose one of those routes after we've finished the presentation. Taught modules take up 120 credits out of a total of 180 credits for this programme. And of those, there are 7 core modules. So core meaning that they're compulsory modules for the programme. And then you have 1 optional module that you take probably in term 3. At UCL, we have 3 terms in the year, and these run from September to December, January to March, and April to June. And then your dissertation, which is the other 60 credits for your master's programme, this is completed between May and August. Next slide. And this is just a little bit of an overview of how it's structured over the course of the year. And as Becca mentioned, there are 2 strands running through the programme. There's a sort of a social epi strand, and then there's a quantitative methods strand. So as you'll see here, after the induction week in the beginning of September, you'll do epidemiology and statistics, which here you can see. And that will be followed up later in term 2 with regression modelling. And then there's a possibility of doing an optional module in term 3, but it's not mentioned there, in more advanced statistics. So you go from the basic to sort of middle level to advanced over the course of your 1 year of study, or more years if you're doing it on a part-time or flexible basis. And at the same time, there's the social epi strand. So you begin with dimensions of inequality in term 1, where you introduce the basic concepts and theories. This is followed up by social determinants of global health in term 2. And finally, in term 3, health inequalities over the life course, which is led by Becca and Professor Anne McMunn this year. In addition, there is a research methods module that happens in term 2, where you'll be introduced to the basic ideas of how to set up your own research, how to design a research question, and think about all the factors that you need when designing research, from how you collect the data through to ethical approval. And finally, there's the dissertation. And the dissertation will build on all the work you've done over the course of your 3 terms. So the social epi modules and the statistical modules, and you'll sort of showcase what you've learned within the dissertation. And that's your chance to do an independent piece of work. And you'll have a supervisor, and you'll work closely with that supervisor, probably meeting every couple of weeks over the May to August period. And then you submit your dissertation in early September. So in terms of assessment, we try to make the assessment as forward-facing as we can. And what we mean by that is that it will relate to sorts of things that you might need to do when you get a job. So the same sorts of things. So you might need to write some sort of critical critique to a particular audience. You might need to do a literature review. You might need to write a grant proposal. appraise literature, you might need to do a data analysis report. So all of these things are ways in which we assess you over the course of the programme. And you'll get several opportunities, for example, for essay writing. There'll be a shorter essay in term 1, slightly longer in term 2, another opportunity in term 3 to build on those skills. You also get the opportunity to do oral presentations, individual, paired or group, depending on the optional module that you take. So is this degree for you? Well, and this may sound a little corny, but we think it's right. You have to be passionate. And we are passionate. We're passionate about making a positive change in the world. You need to be enthusiastic. You need to be happy to debate issues around inequalities. And in the photo here, you can see a group from a couple of years ago. We all went out for lunch to celebrate at the end of the year. This is the MSc for you if you're looking for MSc that teaches you basic skills for analysing and interpreting health data, from small data sets to really, really large data sets, providing that evidence in a succinct form to other people, for other people to understand. Maybe you're interested in becoming part of our diverse student cohort. We have a large network of alumni from the years of the programme, and we encourage students who join the programme to become part of that network and take advantage of that. Next slide. So these are some of the questions that you might consider if you came and joined us on this programme. So, is your status in society associated with your health? Quite a basic question. And I think it's something that will definitely come up in your first Dimensions of Inequality module in term 1. Why is COVID-19 more common in some ethnic groups? Maybe you can provide us with an answer today. What's the association between childhood circumstances and adult health? So this is something that Becca particularly looks at, and I'm sure she'd answer any questions you have about that today. So these are some of the sorts of questions that that students may ask and may need to consider as they work across the course of our master's programme. I'm going to pass you back to Becca now.
Okay, thanks, Anne. And so what do our students say about their studies with us? So we have really high levels of student satisfaction. In fact, 100% reported of our students reported that they were satisfied overall with the quality of the course. And equally, 100% of our students said that they felt really well supported to study independently and that it was easy to keep contact with staff as well. So our students are really very satisfied with their time here with us at UCL. And in terms of a kind of next step, so we often get asked this in open days, is where do your graduates go? So our students or our alumni really go into a real range of different professions. So lots of our alumni go to work in research. So whether that's as a social epidemiologist or as a kind of clinical epidemiologist or as potentially as data analysts. But there's a real range of different destinations. So we have people that work in public health departments, in NGOs, sometimes in pharmaceutical companies or for health insurers. So a real range of things. We have a LinkedIn alumni group, which we can let you have access to, and we can maybe potentially put a link for that in the chat later on, or you can email us about that. But that's quite a good way of seeing what our previous students have ended up going to do, and potentially you can get in contact with them and discuss kind of how they found the masters and what that's meant for them going forwards. We sometimes get asked about scholarships. So we have one scholarship that's available specific to this programme. So if you're interested in social epidemiology at UCL, I assume that you know who Michael Marmot is. So we have the Sir Michael Marmot Scholarship, and this provides £2,500 towards tuition fees for full-time or part-time students. And the deadline for applications for that will come in June of 2023. And there's more details about the scholarships on our social epidemiology website at UCL if you're interested in applying for that. And that's basically the end of our kind of little presentation. And so we'd really like to hear whether you've got any specific questions following that. You can either raise your hand or pop a question in the chat, and perhaps if I stop sharing so that I can see everybody. Yeah, please feel free to ask some questions if there was anything that you weren't so sure about or would like us to cover a bit more. Great, so there's a question in the chat asking generally how big are our cohorts. So it fluctuates a little bit, but generally, and we're between sort of 20 to 25, that sort of size most years.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, so we're a fairly small like program, but actually the way that our modules work, you're often taught with students from other programs. So our masters in population health, for example, masters in dental public health, and other masters programs from outside of our department. So at the very largest, we are about 180 students on our biggest basic statistics module, but there are the first of the social epidemiology modules, the dimensions of inequality that Anne talked about, is largely taken by just our students. So you still have that opportunity to really get to know your cohort of students.
If you'd prefer just to ask a question, then just unmute yourself and we're happy to help.
Hi, yes, I was typing something, but it takes too long. So I come from a position of already having a master's in public health broadly. So I'm looking at being a bit more focused on epidemiology and social epidemiology in particular. I was wondering, in terms of research-wise, what opportunities there are to work with development partners, whether through existing connections or through your connections, this kind of thing. So what opportunities there are with that, and also the opportunities to take things forward to a PhD as well.
Shall I start, Becca?
Yeah, sure.
So I think, first of all, partners. So the program is not partnered with development as such. It's a very intensive year. I don't know where you did your other studies, but in the UK, master's programs are quite intensive, whereas maybe in the US, it's a 2-year program and there's a little bit more flexibility. I think the one place where you will have an opportunity to work closely with one particular research will be in the dissertation. We are very open to people coming with ideas for dissertation projects that aren't necessarily from our staff. So sometimes people would come with a data set that we're not aware of and a proposal, and they'll seek out people within the institute to see who might be able to help. We can't guarantee that, but that's really encouraged. So if you had an idea that you were sort of really passionate about, they do write to Becca or I, email us, and we'd be happy to chat further about that specifically. In terms of going on to do PhD, yes, it's quite common. We had a look one day and we were quite surprised to see that rather high proportion of people that actually do go on to do PhDs. Not all in our institute, but a lot at UCL. And some people, I think, have done a PhD and then they've stayed on. And I think maybe Becca, you'd like to.
Yeah, so I'm one of those people. So I actually took this master's program myself back in 2007, and I ended up staying to do a PhD because at that time a big new research group was starting up, and the International Centre for Life Course Studies, which is where I'm still based. And so a PhD opportunity came up at the time at which I was doing a dissertation with researchers that ended up leading that research program. So it was sort of quite nice timing. So the dissertation really was the route in for me, and I think for a lot of other people that end up staying on in the department. because you get to work on that topic, and so it becomes a bit easier to write a PhD proposal based on it with a really good team of people behind you. So
I mean, I think the one thing about the programme is because it has these two strands, it has the social epi and the quantitative methods, you find that a lot of people come for one or the other. So a lot of people are really interested in just gaining these quantitative skills, but within the context of social epi, it's something they're interested in, but it's not really the thing that they want to do in the future. And so they'll get those skills and they'll go on and do a PhD or go into, become a data analyst, maybe in a slightly different field. So we have people going from this institute to other institutes, within UCL or further afield. And then there's other people who, as in the case of Becca, who just became passionate about social epi and has stayed, and it's great. And we have quite a number of PhDs in the department. If it's something that's you're particularly interested in, then we could probably, arrange for you to have a chat with someone about that. That would be fun. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, it does, very much so. One final quick question. Which statistical software do you use?
So we teach Stata, which is what most researchers within our department use. We also provide, certainly for our basic statistics module, which I lead, we provide materials for learning R, but we don't teach R and we don't assess in it, but there's the opportunity to learn that alongside if you want to as well.
Thank you.
There are a couple of questions now in the chat. So the first question, do you have attendance obligations, e.g. a required rate of attendance? So yes, we do. There is a minimum of 70% attendance, but we would really encourage everyone to try and attend all classes, just because sometimes something unexpected happens and you have to miss a couple. And so if you'd set out not planning to attend everything and then you miss a couple more because you're poorly or ill, then I think that would impact on your learning. So we do encourage people to attend as much as possible. For people who are not sure, Kobe, whether you're proposing to be part-time or modular flexible, then we're happy to have a chat about a balance between work and studying, and some modules are more compact, other modules are on specific days, so we can usually work out something that fits with around people's schedules. We're fairly flexible in terms of the order in which you have to do modules. I think the only module that has to be done first would be basic stats, would need to be done before regression modeling, but apart from that, it's probably pretty flexible. Does that answer your question? Great. Yes. Okay, perfect. And then Becca, would you like to take the next question?
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat asking how this Masters in Social Epidemiology differs from the Masters in Population Health. So the Masters in Population Health in many ways I think is a broader a master's degree, because you have more choices of the modules that you choose. The Social Epi Masters is very much a Masters in Social Epidemiology, and we've put together a program, a really coherent program of modules that really work well and builds sort of one on the other going throughout the year. So I think it really depends on what you're interested in and what you might potentially want to do afterwards. So if you thought that you might want to do something to do with, I don't know, like healthcare delivery or policy, then perhaps the Masters in Population Health might be a better fit, because you could choose more modules to do with that kind of topic. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's the main difference, and so the core modules that are required in the MSc in Population Health, there's two that are different. So while they both master's programs do epidemiology and statistics in term one, the MSc in Population Health students, they do a module on sort of population health practice and concepts and theories, and then in term two we'll have a module on health systems delivery. So while we would be doing it within the Masters of Social Epi, we'd be looking at these social epi modules. So I think that's the That's the main difference. You could choose to do the MSc in population health and take social epi module from term 2 or term 3. But that's the main differences in terms of the compulsory. If you have a look on the website, it should be fairly clear. If you have any queries, then please come back to us. Any other questions from anybody else?
Hi, sorry, I have more of a
Hi.
broad question, so don't worry if it's that, but I read that on the website, UCL offers a master's bursary. I was wondering if you knew anything about that in general.
Yes. Is it being offered for this coming year?
I believe so, yeah, it says
Okay.
2023 to 24.
So it's not managed by us. I think there's clear guidance on the website of how to apply. I think last year there were 30, I believe. So if you have any questions about it once you've had a look at the guidance, then please come back to us and we'll do our best to help. There's also a scholarship available on the MSc, and we put that link in the chat as well.
Okay, thank you.
I think if you're UK based and you do full-time and possibly now part-time, you can get I think a student loan. It used to be just full-time, but I think it may have changed to possibly part-time as well now. Any other questions about the programme, about UCL, about coming to live in London or the UK? Where is everybody from? Are you all from the UK or are you from further afield? Kobe's from the UK. Ah, Amber, you're at Imperial. Ah, okay. Emily. Ah,
Okay.
Natalia's from the US. Oh dear, is it? I hope it's not terribly early for you. Great. Any other questions?
There's a couple in the chat, and so there's
a
one
couple
about,
more. I missed one.
would it be possible to hear a bit more about the research work that we both do?
Okay.
Would you like to go first?
Yes, I can start. So I'm part of the East-West research group, and we do work in Eastern Europe, looking at the mortality gap between East and Western Europe. We work in Czech Republic, Poland and Lithuania, looking at how social factors impact on health. And we've been studying a particular cohort for about 20 years, 15, 20 years, something like that. Started a little bit before I arrived, but so started out as a study just looking at the mortality gap, and has now become a study that actually looks at healthy aging, and looks at some of the determinants of what decides that trajectory as people get into older age, and also looking at retirement age and the factors that determine whether people stay in employment longer, because clearly this is a big question for governments now, is, you know, what can you do to encourage the workforce to keep working that little bit longer? Becca.
Yeah, so I'm based with the International Centre for Life Course Studies, as I mentioned. So all of my research is life course research that uses longitudinal data sets that follow up the same people over time. And I guess at the moment I'm working on 2 research projects. One looks at experiences of domestic abuse and the mental health of parents and children, and sort of how well domestic abuse is picked up in primary care records, but also in some of the cohort studies that we use. So that's one project, and that's joint with the Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health. The other project I'm currently working on is a big cross-European project looking at how being an informal carer potentially affects health, and how that might be different in different European countries. So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the moment. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
There are a couple more questions in the chat. So Kobe, I'm currently studying an MSc in health psychology at UCL. Would it be relatively easy to transfer? Would there be any recognition of prior learning, for instance, statistics units, which I believe have crossover? That's a quite specific question. I think probably the best thing to do, Kobe, would be to email me or Becca, and we can have a chat with you about that and see where you've got to it within the MSc Health Psychology. Would that be okay? Yeah. There's another question, I think.
About what degree backgrounds do we usually see from applicants? Yes. A real range, I think, is the answer. All sorts of things. So not everybody comes in with a background in health. We've had students that have studied all sorts of things. I'm trying to think. So we had a student a couple of years ago that studied horticulture or something, hadn't they? Before, we've had students that have studied policy or economics. We get students that have come from with a nursing degree.
Anthropology and Spanish.
Anthropology, yes. A real range of different things. So, and all of that background is really valuable, I think, for this master's program. So it's a quite diverse student body that we have.
I think it's probably important to say, because we have talked a lot about statistics, that we don't assume prior knowledge. We expect total openness and willingness to do your best. And to work hard in the stats modules, but we don't expect anyone to come with prior knowledge of statistics. Becca, do you want to tell them a little bit how it works?
Yeah, sure. So I lead the term 1 basic statistics module, and we start for the really basic level. So how to calculate a percentage, what a mean is. So we start at that kind of level, but we do move fairly quickly.
Can everybody hear Becca?
I think it cut out slightly.
I think it did, didn't it? Yes. Yeah. So we'll come back to that question in a minute once she rejoins. I think she's dropped. Were there any other questions meanwhile? Yeah, I think we've lost Becca. I'm sure she'll be back in a moment. Are you considering doing the program full-time, part-time, modular flexible? What's your current thoughts? Alice, full-time. Okay. Well, we hope to see you in October. And Emily, great. And Amber. Okay. Oh, Becca, you're back. That's great. You wouldn't mind sort of winding back and just giving us a little bit of sort of, so we got as far as you go from basic means and percentages.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
It fizzled out. Yeah.
So what I said was just to myself, apparently, that by the end of term 1 you can actually do something quite useful with statistics. So you can use data and you can do regression, which is a fairly useful method. Well, it's a really useful method for lots of different things, and a lot of the advanced methods actually really build on that. So the other thing is that we teach statistics in a really applied way. So there's not lots of equations to learn. We don't expect you to calculate anything by hand. what we really want you to come to, like the point of Christmas, knowing is like when to use the correct statistical test, how to do it and state it, and how to like report it and interpret it appropriately. That's what we're really after. So it's very applied and hopefully not scary.
Great. I think there's one more question in the chat. Are there opportunities to look at climate change as a social element? I think definitely it would be an opportunity, probably within the social determinants of global health module, where we look at the really broad sort of framework of factors that are impacting on health. And I think that definitely would come under that. There's a really nice opportunity on that program to do group project, where you're given fairly free rein within the group to choose a topic. I think at the moment that is probably not taught on the program, but I don't think people are limited to the factors that are actually within the module. There's an opportunity to a lot of sort of independent research and gathering of evidence there. And we actually have the presentations on Friday. I'm quite looking forward to it. It's quite exciting. It's always a good day. Yes, so I think definitely there is opportunity. And I think the other thing to say is that at UCL, it's a really big institution. And it's not just about what you do on the program. There are so many lectures and seminars and events that you can attend. And being in London also, if you haven't lived in London before, there are lots of other universities around who also hold events. So you can, you can go along to other events in other places. So, it's a great place to be. If there's something specific that you're interested in, then I'm sure you'd find an opportunity to go along and hear about it. Any other questions? I guess one thing that we haven't mentioned, maybe Becca, is we haven't talked about student reps, so academic representatives. So we have a quite close working relationship with the students. So each program, we get volunteers to be student reps who sort of have a more close relationship with the program leads to talk about issues that may be important for the cohort. And then they get together with other students from other programs within the institute, and then they get together with the faculty, and there's an opportunity to sort of, you might be a faculty rep, or you may be a representative within the student union. So there's lots of opportunity to do other things at UCL, and within your program to help shape, the way the program is taught in future years. And I think we had a very interesting project that we looked at last year with a couple of students that Becca and I were helping with, looking at inclusivity in the curriculum. And I think that's impacted on how we do things this year. And I think Becca has a new project going forward. Maybe. Possibly.
Maybe, we'll wait to hear.
So there's lots of opportunity to do things other than the pure course, to actually sort of potentially change the direction of how things are taught in the future, if that's something you're interested in. Equally, there are lots of clubs and societies. I have students who are in UN debating societies. Another one does ballet. Another one does tango, some do badminton, chess, rugby. Yes, yeah. So there's lots and lots of opportunity to do different things. String quartet, lots and lots, depending on what you're interested in. Okay, well, if you have any other questions that come to mind after we've finished, then please let us know. We'll put our email addresses in the chat, but if you go onto the website, you will see them there. We do not have your contact details. They're held by UCL. So if you do want to us to contact you, you'll need to email us, and then we're happy to respond to your queries. So, thank you for coming along today. If there's nothing else, then goodbye from me.
Okay, bye everybody. Thank you.